Okay, well, I'll kick things off. Welcome everybody to the webinar on common mistakes in acquiring a healthcare startup. I'm Paul Shrimp. I'll be the panel moderator. I'll talk a little bit about who I am and the background about me and the organization I'm with, which is Profit. We'll spend just maybe 5 minutes kind of setting the context of why this panel came to be and the issues that we're looking to talk about. And then really, I'll stop talking and let Jamie, Taylor, and Lakshmi riff on a number of questions because that's what you all came to hear. We've got about an hour blocked. We will be kind of stopping about 15 minutes to go just to field Q&A. We'll probably be waiting at the end to field those questions, but feel free to submit them as we go in the chat, and as they're timely, we might field them as we go. So definitely keep this fluid. We do want to make this as much of a conversation with the panelists and the audience as much as it is panelist to panelist. So welcome, and we'll dive on in. So a little background of Profit and really how this webinar fits into the larger scheme of things is Profit's designed to be helping our clients unlock uncommon growth in the face of disruption. But normally we come in when a large business is kind of stuck or is in decline or needs to essentially get unstuck, or in these days, transform, digitally transform, et cetera. We work across all industries. Healthcare makes out about a third of our business. And we've got a number of different thought leadership that we put in the market, a lot around consumerism, a lot around digital transformation, particularly in the B2B space, and bringing those studies to bear. This is one of those thought leadership pieces where we're trying to connect the dots, particularly around driving that growth, and more specifically, how organizations look to drive growth through acquisition, which is a common tool. And this really builds upon a couple of issues. One, in the healthcare arena, of trying to make sure that we understand both sides of the equation during a transaction, during an event, but more specifically, some of the bumps that we're seeing through acquisition behavior that doesn't tend to manifest itself in a way that we'd like to see or hope to see. And I equate that to reading that announcement that somebody's going to buy somebody else and it's going to unlock this great potential. Sometimes that happens. Oftentimes it doesn't. I'm usually working with a number of clients on the larger side, hearing water cooler talk like, when are we going to acknowledge this acquisition's not working? As if unacquiring a company is an option, or, we need to remind them who bought who, or this acquisition screwed up my bonus. But there's a lot of tension and stress after the acquisition that's not really appreciated. And what the acquirer doesn't always understand is the lens through the smaller startup, what they're going through, what they've designed their business on. And this is one giant panel discussion to get large enterprises a view from the startup side. And hopefully with some Q&A, we'll understand a little bit about both sides, because really that empathetic view of the acquiree and the acquirer is very critical. Joining us today, we've got a number of CEOs, and across the body, they'll be able to kind of bring a lens of literally hundreds of different startups, what they're thinking about, how they walk and talk, how they plan their days, what their hopes are. The first is Jamie Edwards. He's a CEO of Cloudbreak, also a health transformer with Startup Health. He is on the mission to humanize health, and Cloudbreak is the world's first true telehealth marketplace and unified telehealth platform. Prior to that, Jamie was the CEO of Emergent Medical Associates, a multi-specialty medical group providing ER, hospitalist, and anesthesia services. He's a common panelist on PIMS, Startup Health, DocSF, Dell EMC Healthcare, and many others. So welcome, Jamie.
Great to be here. Thanks, Paul.
Yeah. We also have Lakshmi Shenoy. She's the CEO of Embark Collective, a startup hub in Tampa that works across both healthcare and non-healthcare organizations. Again, about 20% to 30% of her members are healthcare organizations. And prior to that, she was with 1871 in Chicago, which is the #1 university-affiliated business incubator in the world. She also serves on the board of Junior Achievement and the Florida Aquarium. So that's going to come in handy when we talk about crustaceans in the North Atlantic in the back half part of this call. So welcome, Lakshmi.
I'm ready for the animal welfare segment.
Yes. And lastly, we've got Taylor McPartland. He's passionate for empowering entrepreneurs to chase solutions to address systematic problems that face our society. So a lot of the startups he works with are mission driven, and he's really focused Scale Health, which he's the CEO of, and the subsequent foundation to help those global health innovators to build kind of that ecosystem and that connection throughout the world to kind of further that mission of the underserved and needed in the healthcare community. So welcome, Taylor.
Awesome. Thanks, Paul. Excited for this.
Yes. Like I said, some mixed questions in the chat as we go. Here's some contact information. It's 2020. Look us up on LinkedIn. Look us up on Google. We're not that hard to find. If you're nervous, do a screen grab. I know these hyperlinks obviously don't work on a Zoom screen, and we'll get started. So I want to first kind of kick things off with a little bit more introduction and understanding of each of you. And you obviously have built careers around the startup space. And would love to know, what was that calling or what was that inspiration that pulled you into the world of startups? And I'd love to hear from you first, Taylor.
Yeah, I think from my standpoint, I had run a company previously to starting scale, and that company was one that where I'd spent the majority of my professional career. And so when I exited out of that, I really wanted to kind of recalibrate where I was passionate and where I thought I could provide the most value. And so for me, I'm not, I don't have a PhD or any kind of advanced degree from that perspective, but I do have a strong network, and I know a lot of people that have those type of degrees and are very passionate about dedicating their lives to furthering health innovation. I think that, coming from the startup world and living and breathing that, I know how challenging it is to dedicate your life to running a startup, and it can even be more challenging when that startup in an industry is as complex and as tricky as healthcare. And so for me, my goal really is and the goal of Scale Health is to really break down as many barriers and open as many doors for those type of entrepreneurs as we can, to simplify their job so that the only thing they have to do is the hard enough job of running a successful startup. And so that's what we dedicate ourselves to. And that's really the passion and calling for me.
That's great. And Lakshmi, Embark Collective is your second startup hub that you've been part of the leadership team. What's drawn you to the world of not only startups, but startup hubs?
Yeah, it's an unusual career path that didn't exist 10 years ago, to be able to operate a startup hub. When I joined 1871 in Chicago, it was really out of a realization that my passions were best served with working with really early stage companies that are just getting off the ground, and there's patterns to business building that we could share with those companies, with first time and even multi-time entrepreneurs, that would help them avoid some of the typical pitfalls. I got recruited to come down to Tampa, Florida, to build a similar type of hub. So I got to build this from scratch with all of the knowledge of what worked and didn't work in Chicago. So this is a startup for startups. It's as meta as you get, or foolish as you get, but we're having a lot of fun with it. So we're in our first full year of operation right now. What a year to be your first year of operation. And so we're learning a lot along the way while we're helping startups figure out how to navigate this year in their early stage. So every day is filled with a ton of learnings, and that's ultimately what drives me, is being able to use the knowledge that I have to help someone grow an entity from scratch. And I get the privilege. In Chicago, I worked with 500 different companies. Here, we're currently serving over 50 companies. So it allows me to put different hats on every single day.
Yeah, and congratulations on opening in your space just weeks before the pandemic lockdown. So
quite
the irony.
And we're back in here. So it's in the past. Not really.
Yeah. Well, on the topic of wearing different hats, Jamie, you're like our hybrid practitioner, community builder, healthcare transformer. Would love to get a sense of what drawn you into the startup space, why you're a CEO of one yourself, why you help other CEOs, but would love to hear that context in that story.
Yeah. Well, for me, I took a class in college called Entrepreneurship and Personal Enterprise from, a very hallowed kind of entrepreneurship professor. And I really became enamored with the basic concept of being an entrepreneur, which is that I could take an idea in my head, make it real, and then make it impact people and matter in a really positive way. And that basic value creation, like, really struck me. I was like, wow, I could, everyone talks about how many times have you been in a room and you're like, oh, I had that idea 5 years ago, but you didn't act on it, right? So someone else did. And I didn't want to be the person who didn't act on it. And so I got hooked really the first time I wrote a business plan, and started really digging in on like what businesses were all about and the human behavior that needed to follow for that business to be successful, and how you set up really good cultures, and how, the sexy part of entrepreneurship, which is that exit, was never really the reason people became entrepreneurs in the first place. It was because we were out there to try and solve a problem. And so I became very enamored with that. And in fact, realized in going through this class that I didn't have some of the skills that I wanted, that I thought a great entrepreneur needed. And so my finance skills were terrible. I didn't understand accounting. I grew up in the time of Enron, right? So I was like, I never wanted a CFO to be able to pull the wool over my eyes. And I really wanted to understand how to raise capital and do those types of things. So for the first 10 years of my career, I was an investment banking and private equity professional. And only once I kind of built that skill set up and felt confident enough did I then go into saying, well, now it's time to really get involved in operating and managing a business and trying to, make that mission and deliver on a mission and have that really create value. And the value creation thing is interesting because the value creation that I'm talking about is really about how you create value for the people who are going to use your product, right? But if you do that, the value creation that your investors and everybody else wants and that end game is what materializes from it, which is kind of what we're here to talk about today, right?
Absolutely. And I definitely want to build on a number of those issues, which is in this space in particular, when we talk about acquisitions, it's not like buying another large organization where you're getting scale or access to customers, or it's a competitive move and you can almost just bolt on another business unit. We acquired this company, it's going to be our division of XYZ. We're really talking about these startups. And as Jamie, you mentioned, like for them, it's an exit. And it's an acquisition for one side, it's an exit for another, which may or may not involve an exit of people, but an exit of that entity kind of holding on. And to Lakshmi's points around spotting patterns, like what are the common kind of catalysts or needs that you often see startups being purchased for? What's the event? What's the expectation at the highest level?
Do you want me to take that one, or?
Yeah, dive on in.
Okay. Companies acquire companies for a broad variety of different reasons. It might be to add an additional product. It might be, something we're going to dive into, I know, here a little bit later, the concept of an Aqua hire, where you're looking to try and add a team to augment your, it might be a development team, whatever it might be. There's a broad variety of reasons as to why you do it. It might be some companies acquire companies to actually eliminate a competitor and take more control and market share. So there's a number of different catalysts. I think what most people don't realize is, as an entrepreneur, when you think about an exit, for me, it's like one chapter ending and another chapter beginning, but it can still be that same book. Like maybe that chapter is with the next company, helping them really grow a new line of business, helping them change, or augment their culture, whatever it might be. But that's kind of typically how I think about it.
Awesome. And Lakshmi, I know you've talked a lot about acqui-hires. I'd love to get a little bit more specifically in kind of what you've been seeing and why people do those.
Yeah, so I get to work with companies that are early stage. Oftentimes they haven't even taken institutional capital, and but they find these opportunities for acquisition. And typically the product exists and it's there and it's sound and it can add value, but the acquiring company is really more interested in the team that built it and what that team can bring to that acquiring company. The talent that can take an idea and launch it from scratch, and what does that capability do within a larger entity that might say, well, this is the way we've always done it, and having that fresh perspective saying, maybe we could do it this way to get it off the ground faster. And sort of in that same vein of that different perspective is just the cultural infusion of energy and sort of that startupness that the acquiring company may find that they're lacking, and this is a fast way to embed a team that exudes that, with the hope that it's a little bit contagious in the culture of the overall organization. Doesn't always work, but the intent is fair.
Okay, good point. And I would love to get thoughts on, we just said like not all acquisitions are the same. They've got different intentionality. So what becomes more important, less important as you move, say, from a point solution to a platform, to a technology, to an acqui-hire? Those are all different types of assets, but how does that shift the pressure and where you need to prioritize in the integration aspect? I'll let anybody jump in. I know, Taylor, you.
Yeah, I'll jump in quick. I think that, Lakshmi brought up a great point around this concept of, we'll acquire this company and we hope that they will provide some value to what we're trying to do. And I think that one challenge that I've seen is that there is a lot of, one of the first roadblocks, or one of the first pitfalls, I should say, is that there is often a lot of hope put on the acquisition. And I think one way to mitigate that is to have a clear understanding of what is the purpose of this acquisition. Is it for the talent? Is it for the culture? Is it for the technology? Is it, as Jamie mentioned, just to eliminate a competitor? And depending on having a clear sense of what path you're going down, mitigates that risk to a certain extent, and also really gives you a clearer path of what steps you need to take to make sure that acquisition is actually productive and increases the value of both entities.
Yeah, the one thing that I would add to that, we live in this era where a lot of studies have shown that you have less than a 50-50 shot of creating value with an acquisition. So why is M&A such a big deal if if the odds in the casino are better, right? And what really makes this type of stuff work is really good discipline, and kind of, Taylor and Lakshmi said the why is really important, right? The why this is happening, but then what's after that, the discipline that comes with how you're going to integrate. And it's almost so much more important not just to get the deal done, but how you've planned things afterwards. Because a lot of times the why, you have to avoid this kind of concept of confirmation bias, because you've decided to do the deal. And once you've decided to do the deal, you need to make sure that your diligence isn't reaffirming all of those beliefs, and that you're actually being open and objective and not rationalizing something that you might, end up finding through that diligence, so that you're very realistic about what happens afterwards. And you talked about these different types of acquisitions. The discipline of M&A is fairly consistent across all those different types of deals, right? It's consistent across deal size. You have to do the same things for a big deal that you have to do for a small deal, right? You still have to do diligence. You still have to go through and make sure that you've, dotted your I's and crossed your T's. And in fact, some smaller deals take more time than bigger deals do, because the smaller companies aren't as well prepared for diligence, aren't as well prepared to do those types of things. So at the core, it's really figuring out how to meld cultures, what roles are required for the team that you're acquiring. What roles do you see them having post-sale? How do you integrate mission? How do you integrate product? How do you integrate sales teams? Those are very similar challenges across, regardless of the purpose of the deal, right?
It's an excellent point. And I want to move a little bit more into due diligence as it relates to culture, because it's come up a few times. And whenever I see an announcement for an acquisition, it's going to give us a technology, it's going to give access to this market. And then after the deal happens, it's just a big conversation about culture. And if culture comes up so often as a kind of snag, how is that addressed in due diligence and the integration, if at all? Should it be? Would love some thoughts there, Lakshmi.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because, so you think about the acquisition process, oftentimes it's going to include sort of a dedicated set of stakeholders on the enterprise side from an M&A team, and then the senior leadership from the startup. And the culture of the startup, yes, is very much dictated by that senior leadership team, but it is really implemented or delivered by the team members. And so, I think there's that there's that tension there where you've got the rest of the startup entity that's not necessarily a part of what it means and what it takes to have the cultural integration that everybody in the room where the deal happens agrees that, yeah, of course we can make that occur. My team is of course aligned with all of this. And so just thinking about not only, knowing a lot about Profit's work, the socialization of the cultural integration from the enterprise side, but ensuring that equal attention goes to the startup side, because think about those team members. They did not necessarily join that original startup to be a part of a giant organization. And so it really is a shift and may challenge some of the motivations for why they do their job on a day-to-day basis.
That's a really good point. I mean, it can be hard to quantify specifically what that culture means, but it really is the through line that made that company that you're acquiring so attractive to you to begin with. And if you're coming in and not being hyper conscious of what that culture is and what made that company unique enough to draw your attention and to acquire you, you might run the risk of very quickly alienating a lot of those team members and shooting yourself in the foot before you're even able to, see the value that you've anticipated or that you've hoped for.
Yeah, and Jamie, you mentioned a lot just even earlier on just the founders, and there's certain myths and realities as it comes through founders' intentionalities. I'd love for you to kind of build on a lot of what was just said, but particularly with the founder, because arguably that person's one of the, if not the most important human asset in that acquisition.
Yeah, I mean, look, culture is something that for me, even when I was doing M&A deals as a banker, like we didn't really spend that much time thinking about, it was like, did the numbers fit together? Does this product line work? It wasn't like, do these businesses actually want the same things? Which is a key thing. So there's not enough time spent about it in M&A processes at all. And each organization has its own social psychology. And if you don't have a shared sense of core values and beliefs, and parts of the organizations are naturally going to chafe against each other. And one of the key things is, it's like you take a look at some of the M&A, and look, I think we're fortunate now to actually have some very large corporate startups, I would call them. You take a look at someone like Amazon, you take a look at Facebook. That's a much different thing than having like GE go out and acquire a startup, right? Culturally speaking. So I think when your cultures are similar, and if you have a startup-minded culture, your skeleton's almost not fully formed, right, in terms of your processes. So you're going to be much more nimble about, bringing on a new appendage. Whereas there's a lot of companies who have been very successful being focused on process and focused on decision making. And if you're used to being nimble and all of a sudden you need to go through multiple approval levels to get something done, and instead of getting it done in a week, it takes you a month, that's going to be super frustrating for dev teams who are used to working in agile and doing 2-week scrums and doing this type of thing. So when you're a founder and all of a sudden this mission that was so important to you now isn't front and center in what is a larger organization, that can be really disheartening. And as a result, you end up seeing these outcomes like acquired assets getting shuttered and closed down. You see teams who were leaving disgruntled or disenfranchised because well, that didn't turn out the way that I thought it was. And then for the acquirer, all that value's really been destroyed. I mean, how many times have we seen an amazing startup get acquired and then you see 3 months later that the founder left? Right. So I think more time needs to be spent on how these appendages are going to become part of the core, and then how you can drive value from that by, keeping the founders engaged.
Yeah. And is there a way to oh, go ahead, Lakshmi, go ahead.
I was just going to say, Jamie said something earlier on that I thought was spot on, which was that the idea of the acquisition for the startup is not supposed to be the end of the book. It's not supposed to be the destination. And while so many founders will start a company to address a specific need, I do think that the way that we socialize it, whether it's the press, it's the storytelling, but however we talk about it, we really are saying that end destination, we're countering what Jamie said, even though what he said is true, we're countering it by saying the goal is acquisition. That means you've hit the major milestone. And so there's not enough thinking that happens around, well, what happens after that? And how does my life change after that? And am I willing to give up control after that? Because I've slaved 24/7, even if you're not working 24/7, 24/7 if your mental load is spent on the company. Am I willing to part ways and basically allow another organization and another set of leaders to be the custodian for something that is essentially a manifestation of the founder, just in a corporate, in a startup form. And I think all of that becomes really challenging. And how do we, for both the enterprise and the startup, ensure that the conversation is not treating that acquisition as like, now that's the period at the end of the sentence instead of it being the comma.
That's such an amazing point. And I think it's, and we're guilty of this too, just being from the startup world, is that exit is the goal. And it's really hard to convince startups or to remind startups that that's not the goal, that is the end of a chapter. And so, potentially as the role of an acquirer, I would highly recommend just having those conversations early on and reminding the founders of a company that you're considering acquiring, like, hey, we're not cutting you a check and you're not becoming an investor or buying an island or whatnot, but we're on a journey together and we want to make sure that this makes sense for the long haul for all of us.
Yeah, Paul, you had mentioned early on in the webinar, right? Like the phrase, let's remind them who acquired who. Like that to a founder is like, it's like, I'll give you like my Home Alone face, right? That's a scary thing to hear, because you want to know that what you've created has value and that you're going to have the opportunity to continue to deliver on this mission that you found so personal that you made all of these sacrifices for. And I just think not enough time is spent on kind of these social issues that come up in M&A. Yes, the numbers have to work out. Yes, the product line needs to fit. But these social issues, I mean, this is where the rubber meets the road on creating value, because you also have to understand that sometimes the exit isn't everything that it's chopped up to be when you read it about in the newspaper, right? Like sometimes you're like, oh my God, that guy just sold his company for $15 million. Dude, I bet he's running out and going to buy a Ferrari or something. He might not have made any money off the acquisition. He might have just gotten some stock in what is the new business, and he needs to see that be successful in order to have gotten any type of liquidity from it. And who really made money were the investors and the angels and everybody else. And, I don't think I think we, as a society, right, we idolize this kind of entrepreneurial view of like getting to exit and getting liquidity, but more often than not, the liquidity is not what was originally contemplated, by the founder. There are those great stories that are out there, and clearly we've borne witness to, American Well going public and GoodRx going public, and now we've got, the SPAC market heating up. So there's multiple types of liquidity that are out there for a bunch of entrepreneurs. But we need to remember that for that founder, like they're still might be betting on that second bite of the apple, and that's a really important way that they're going to create the value that they wanted from the company that they started.
Yeah, no, 100% agree. And there's the company to company aspect, or the deal team, and then where this new startup lives. So if I go with the big, massive enterprises, multi-BU, multi-billion dollars, there's usually a team somewhere going, this would be a great acquisition. Let's do it. And let's plug it into this business unit. And this business unit now gets a new child, we'll call that. But the conversation that happened with the deal and what the day-to-day team is, take the founder, but more so the folks underneath the founder have no idea what that trail of breadcrumbs is and what the agreement are or what the expectations. And Jamie, to your point, it's, oh, hey, we thought you made it big. When are you guys going to leave so we can start, running your project or product or platform for you? And that's not there. And then the other jolt that I'm seeing, and decision making's come up a couple times, which is just this alien universe. And you don't get it in the same equal size acquisitions, but this week I'm working with a sub-$1 billion client and a plus $100 billion client. And the speed of decision making just on that spectrum alone is night and day. Multi-100 billion juggernaut is, here's an idea, let's get a bunch of people to buy in, repeat the story, get a couple sponsors, and then let's have the meeting to make the decision. And the runway to the decision is more important than the actual decision. But would love to get kind of what you guys see in that post-acquisition with the network that in terms of just decision-making in the process jolt that those startups now get plugged into in terms of just getting a single decision made in this new world. I'll let anybody jump in there who's got who's that
Yeah, I mean,
most exposed to it.
from our standpoint, that decision making process that Paul, what you said just completely rings true. I'll even speak for Scale Health side is we start to we'll form a partnership or whatnot with a large corporation, and or even in the negotiations leading up to that process, the way of handling that process is so radically different from a nimble startup, all the way up. We might say we'll have a great conversation, and we might hear on the other end, like, cool, let's circle back at the end of Q2 and we'll sync up again. And meanwhile, as the startup, we're thinking, actually, we're free this Friday. Do you want to just chat then? And so just setting expectations there can be also really challenging, because from the startup side, there might be all kinds of thoughts going through the startup's head of this deal's falling through, sense of insecurity, inferiority, frustration, all that could be happening. Whereas from the other side of the table, it could just be business as usual.
Excellent. Actually, Jamie?
I'm living it right now, just like Taylor had said. I mean, I've been in a 6-month conversation, and I have no idea where I am with it. But things are seemingly happening on the enterprise side, but it's impossible to know because we're not baked into their communication cadence, and so there's no stakeholder over there that is in charge of keeping us in the loop, saying this is normal. Where we are in the process, we're 1/3 of the way through, and here's the buy-in you have, and here's the buy-in we still have to get. And so that level of transparency, because every organization is different, and this would be, whether it was a startup and an enterprise or any two organizations, but giving a little bit of a lens into the decision-making process and the hierarchy that exists within the organization, so the other partner knows whether or not it says a 10% chance or a 90% chance of going through.
Yeah, and if you're a founder, right, large organizations have distinctly different goals than startups who want to take over the world, right? Large organizations have existing cash cows that they might be trying to protect. If they're public, they're worried about what that next earnings call looks like. There's just a risk averseness that comes with sometimes being a larger company because your processes are baked. This is what's make your money. And let's be honest, change is super painful. Whether you're trying to change the culture of an existing organization, you're trying to meld in a new culture, or you're a founder who's now merging into a larger company, that change is just super painful. And having an understanding of, and just going in eyes wide open. If you look at most M&A processes, they start off a little adversarial, right? Like you're trying to negotiate value. Well, my job is to negotiate the most I can. Their job is to get it for as little as possible. And it's not the most collaborative way to start off a relationship, right? It would be really interesting if M&A was more about like, hey, how do we get to the right process here? Let's work together to really come up with the right value. Like, I'm not looking to, get you for $20 million cheaper, and we're just looking to get to the right place, right? Most M&A conversations don't start like that. So then when you start off with that as the tone of the relationship, and then all of a sudden you're working together afterwards, it just creates a very interesting dynamic. And I think not enough attention is paid to, probably by entrepreneurs too, with what life is going to be like after, and how they should be thinking about it, how they should be developing relationships with the people who are on the other side of the table, because the next moment you're going to be sitting on the same side of the table with them. I just think it's something that's not considered. And you had actually, Paul, brought this up before, there are companies who might be created to say, well, we're going to build this and we're going to sell it to Google. It's a point solution, not a platform, right? We're building something for a specific type of exit. And maybe we as entrepreneurs don't think about that enough and are realistic about it to be like, hey, you know what? I'm going to sell it. And then, yeah, my goal is to move on, right? Like, maybe that is the right thing to be doing. Post this, I built it, I sold it. It's going to create value. I'm going to move on to the next thing that can create value. And that's what a lot of serial entrepreneurs end up doing.
That's great. That's great. And we got a couple questions coming in. We're going to be riffing for another 10 or so minutes. We'll turn it back over to Q&A. So if you got any questions, just lob them on in and we'll start fielding them in a few minutes. I want to change tenor to a good problem to have, I guess. So we've been kind of riffing in all the rough spots, but this idea of scaling and actually the perils of scaling too fast or putting unrealistic expectations on scaling. We're going through the profit. We bought a company about a year ago. The demand is crazy, and it's interesting watching a part of the enterprise scale and grow too fast, where the scaling actually begins to work against it, or we start seeing some cracks in the dam that can become much bigger. But would love to get some responses on that. I think, Jamie, you had a couple perspectives early on in terms of like, how do you think about scaling, and particularly the perception of a founder going, oh my gosh, we get the biggest customer ever, we've hit it big, and they're not built to even serve that scale, whereas the enterprise might have different expectations. But would love your perspectives on the good problem of scaling.
Yeah, for us, and most of the companies I've been involved in, like, you always want that, marquee client, marquee customer, and you will change your pricing models and do everything that you can in order to get those kind of folks signed on. And as you get bigger and bigger and bigger, you start to realize you can't do that because it's not a scalable approach. And startups, while they're built to scale, the organizations, there's definitely startups who have outpaced their growth, right? You've outpaced your server farms and your ability to take traffic. I mean, I think from a telemedicine standpoint, we saw that firsthand. And we're seeing it even today with things like Zoom. Like, as quickly as Zoom has grown, like, sometimes you get on a call and it doesn't work the way that it's supposed to work, right? But you can't really fault them because they've grown 1,000%, and that's just an incredible amount of scale that you never thought you would have before. I think when you're a founder and you're going into a larger organization, you have this idea, they're like, this is amazing. All of a sudden, like, my burn I don't have to worry about my burn every day and how I'm going to be paying for that. I'm going to be able to fund a dev team. I'm going to be able to do all these different things because I'm now part of a larger organization. And those are things that need to get really figured out in advance. Like, you should be working on what your budget looks like as a founder before the M&A deal gets done, not after, where you realize that, well, wait, they're kind of underfunding what we need to really scale and grow this business. Like, I know we're going to have to make these investments. What if I can't make them now? And what a bummer to be, acquired and then be in the same situation that you were kind of in before, when you thought you were going to be able to turbocharge your growth. And that was one of the promises of the deal. So there are those types of things that need to be considered.
That's great. Taylor, Lakshmi, any additional thoughts?
I think, that challenge around scaling and how do you fund the scaling prior to that M&A deal, maybe a startup is considering some other type of capital infusion, and to a limited extent, they have at least control of the framework around the process. Obviously, that in and of itself is a whole nother challenge. But having that level of ownership when you're trying to run a fundraising process is very different than having ownership and trying to ask your BU head for the budget to get the funds for you to do what you want to do, and is probably like totally strangling a founder in that process. So I think Jamie's point around just getting ahead of it and knowing, if you truly want the outcomes that are supposed to happen through the acquisition, ensuring that you're planning for it before a deal is finalized.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And, Jamie mentioned early on that, there's a less than a 50% chance of these deals being successful. And I think a lot of that comes down to even with the best intentions. Like, we'll talk with large corporations and they'll say, like, we're looking for this kind of a startup. If you guys have one, that's fantastic. We'd love to explore working with them, but understand that we have a track record of acquiring these startups and eating them alive, even though we don't necessarily want to. And so I think there's certainly opportunities to explore, like, dating before getting married, when it comes to, like, partnering up with startups and corporations, just to see if there's an opportunity to work together.
Great, that's great. Another thought that triggered, it's more of a ways of working, and there's also just, I'll call it the scrappiness of a startup. And one of those aspects is really around this marketing and sales, driving demand, call it winning in the front lines. And if I toggle over to my large enterprise world right now, everybody's trying to fix, Salesforce not being physically present with like, oh, we're going to buy tech. We're going to buy tech. We're going to buy lots and lots of tech, and that's going to fix our demand gen aspect. And last year, I had a conversation with a gentleman that moved from a large pharma company to a startup pharma. And he's like, we're as effective as I was before because we're able to make more use out of a little bit of tech, or maybe some bubble gummed together tech, and just deploy it more pragmatic. But would love to get perspectives on how startups are using a lot of simple tools, and then they get plugged into a bigger enterprise where the limitations around that, or they have to use kind of the bigger tech. But would love to get a little bit of perspectives on how to use do a lot with a little, and also what's tech related and what's just people related. Any thoughts on that?
I'll dive in. So, because we're facing this right now. So as you get older, you first of all, as a startup, you start off as like the CEO going out and doing a bunch of missionary selling, right? So you're out in the field, you're meeting with clients, you're bringing your passion. You might not have all the answers that they need, but you're asking them to basically take a risk on you, right? And say, look, let's do this together. There'll be some bumps in the road, but we can handle them side by side, locking arms, and you're going to have this amazing product. And by the way, you're going to get you're going to get input on the product roadmap. You're really going to help create us as a business, like all these different things that you will tell your first few customers. And then as you get bigger, you're like, wow, we really need Salesforce, and we need to implement that so that we have a proper CRM system, and we need to be looking at our opportunities in a sales funnel, and going through and doing that work. And then you're like, wow, we really need a center of excellence in sales. In order to do that, I need a BDR team, an X team, a Y team, and we need to be doing lead gen and SEO. And all of a sudden it's like, whew, things just got super complex. And so I think what we've discovered as a startup is perfect is the enemy of good. And you can sit there and spend 6 months planning out what the perfect system is, and then work on implementing it and spend X on doing it. Or you can kind of hack together an almost as good solution in a shorter amount of time and just start getting traction and learning and revamping and learning and continuing to tweak in what is this kind of cycle of continuous improvement. So, that would be my takeaway, as perfect is the enemy of good. As you get bigger, you absolutely need more process support, more infrastructure support, and more sophistication when it comes to sales and marketing, because that's really the only way to start competing at that level. But, don't do it, don't put process in at the cost of what is progress.
I think that's a great point. And Paul, going back to the tech versus the people side, we have a tendency to lean, because of what Jamie just said, we lean on the people side of things. And if we're having teams of 1, 2, 3, 4 people that are owning different verticals, empowering them to find a process that makes the most sense for them, and then continuing as a broader team, then continuing to hone that process and think, okay, are we able to manage this with free tools, or at what point do we need to wrap, or is this process leaky to the point where we need to wrap more of a firm operation around it and invest in the sales force or whatnot from there?
The only thing I'd add is that, a startup is made up inherently of problem solvers. They see a problem and they want to go solve it. And so, Paul, to add to your list of, what's the disconnect between, people and tech, I'd also add process to that, because oftentimes you might have the right tech, you might have the right people, but the messiness occurs with why am I following this process? It waves around to all these different places where I see a direct line from me to the solution, and you just have to give me the space to be able to go do it. And I think that speaks to a lot of the issues that we talked about before about culture, is if you are impeding the team's ability to solve problems, that is a very fast way to put out their fire that has allowed them to do everything that they've done with the startup to date.
That's an awesome point, Lakshmi.
That's huge. All right, I want to turn it over to some Q&A. The first one, I'm going to have to rely on the venture capital and private equity skills in the group, but this one's more around kind of unvested options and canceled, that are canceled versus accelerated. Comment was, I think people don't understand how to protect themselves going into a startup So when the M&A event occurs, they have the highest probability to have a positive outcome with regards to their option / equity stake. Any thoughts on that, finance guys? I think that's Jamie. It's not a core part of the conversation, so I know it's a bit of a curveball, and we can always punt on it if it's easier.
No, look, most startups have options plans. It's important that as an employee you read that option plan, because they have different vesting periods, they have different triggers for acceleration, and it's important to understand, what you're signing up for going in. Most employees, I don't think, read the option plan. They get their grant, they're like, sweet, and then the exit happens, they're like, why did I only get this instead of this? I'm doing the math and it doesn't add up. And then they read the option plan and it's like, I get it now, right? Do you have cashless exercise? Do you not have cashless exercise? If you leave the business and they sell 6 months later, do you still have your how much time do you have to buy your options post leaving the business? Like, all of this stuff plays a role. So there's nothing that substitutes for just doing the work and doing your own diligence as an employee when you're signing up, and not just accepting, I think a lot, look, I'm guilty of it. Sometimes we just sign documents, and you really need to read what you're signing and understand it.
Excellent, thank you. And this next question is really aimed at Taylor and Lakshmi, who are closer to the hubs and the activity they're seeing at the hubs. Is what trends are you seeing in the value drivers / types of healthcare innovators that are being acquired? Are we seeing telemedicine pick up, patient empowerment? It could be HCP wellness. What kind of some of the hot trends that you're seeing emerge with your members?
I think just super quickly, on my side, we're not seeing a lot just within our own community. We're not seeing a lot of acquisitions yet from the digital health telemedicine side, just because I think it's still relatively early. I anticipate seeing a lot more of that next year. But we are seeing a huge uptick in that space when it comes to partnerships, pilots, investments, and things like that. So that's COVID is really, exploded the usage on that side of things. So I anticipate seeing more acquisitions in that space in 2021.
Yeah, we're seeing the same. And the other thing I would add is tools around efficiencies. I'll give you one example. There's a company called ProCredX, which has figured out how to put the medical professional credentialing on the blockchain, because normally that process is something like 6 months for a doctor to get credentialed by the hospital, and the hospital has them on payroll, but they can't practice, and it's a total waste, at least from an outsider's point of view. So they're fixing that, and the amount of attention that they are receiving right now is tremendous, because I think the world is realizing that we have to do things quickly, and we have major healthcare problems to solve now. And so when we can find these, it feels like a hack on to enable efficiency. There, a lot of excitement gets generated around there. But to Taylor's point, we're seeing that it is very much the let's date before we get married. So lots of partnership conversations, lots of customer conversations are happening.
I think you're on mute, Paul.
Yeah. You mentioned something with blockchain. I've only met a few of your founders, Lakshmi, and they all seem to be in blockchain. But there's a common trait that I've noticed as I talk to founders, and it's not one-to-one, everybody's different, but the idea of I have an innovation, how do I put it to work? Or I have an approach that could, change something. And usually the larger enterprises are coming from we need to access a certain area of the market, or we're exposed in this area, and it's kind of market back. And I just noticed there's a tendency in the biases with a lot of members, which is I have an innovation, or this could generate value somehow. But that's another interesting dynamic that I've noticed is people kind of look for opportunity. It's the innovation, and then where's the market, usually on the founder side, not always. And then likewise, the opposite, where's the market? How do I plug it with the right innovation? Is just how they problem solve.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing that I loved about where Lakshmi went when she was talking about this company is that it wasn't a blockchain company. This company is using the blockchain to solve a real issue. right? So there's too many companies, I think, that are out there that are technologies chasing a solution, as opposed to being like, wow, there's a problem here I need to solve. How do I deploy the right technologies against this problem? And it sounds like her company is doing exactly that, right? So that's the type of stuff that you want to see coming out of accelerators and incubators that's really moving the needle. And I know, over at Scale Health, there's a number of companies that are doing that.
Yeah, agree. So we got a few more minutes. Happy to take some more questions. The other one I'd like to probe on as we wait for more is this. It comes in a change management, but it's a sloppy term. But there's this. I use it in quotes. As you guys know, at the beginning call, once I think of a quote or a story, it kind of goes, how do we think about that? But it's we're going to acquire this new startup to do something different, which is we bought you because you're different, or we hired you because you're different. And then 2 weeks later, it's like, that's not how we do it here. And there's this aspect of like, how do we prevent organ rejection when the higher ups say we need to do something different? We pull them in, and the lower down's going, that's not how we do it here. But would love people's thoughts on how that's been able to be overcome, or how do you stay in front of that challenge? Because it's just happened so frequently from an Aqua hire to a full acquisition.
I'm seeing an increase in willingness to at least physically not necessarily integrate. And so allowing a startup to, if they're in a different market, allowing them to stay in that other market so you can do some sort of preservation of the culture. I don't know if the benefit that you're talking about of like, we acquired you because you're different is necessarily fully felt through the organization, but it is a way, I used a flame metaphor the last time, but if you think of the startup as like a bright flame, how do you not put it out as the enterprise? And maybe by just letting it sit away from all of the other the ways to bat the flame, you have a better chance of doing that, but it may come at a risk of not getting the full intended benefit if culture and different thinking is what you were going for.
Yeah, for me, I think if you take a look at, especially in large tech, we kind of wonder why, certain companies aren't around anymore, like Bulk Computing or whoever, Compaq, whoever it might be, Gateway, right? All these companies that had built very prolific businesses way back when. And it's because changing a culture is a really hard thing to do. And most people aren't willing to take a little bit of a hit in the short term, especially if you're a public company, to realign yourself with what the market might need. Right. And so when you're a startup and you're going in and this company is pointed in one direction, and really to get you to integrate properly, they need to just kind of move 5 degrees this way. Like that's a big ask in a lot of larger organizations who might not say, wow, you know what, this product development team is actually better than my own. Maybe I should be getting rid of my own team and using these guys. Like, unfortunately, the product development team who's been there for 20 years is like, no, we need to mold them to fit what we're doing. And so you really need buy-in from all the different parts of the organization to really make sure it's executed well and to make sure that the pieces of the puzzle fit together without chafing too much.
And that goes back a little bit to one of the points that we made earlier. I think that startups really do feel like they come from the innovation or from the solution standpoint first, not necessarily knowing all the pieces. And so they might go into a meeting with a potential acquirer or partner and say, like, I've got this solution and it's better than what you guys are using and you should use this. And they very well might be 100% true without realizing, to Jamie's point, how painful change might be. And even if their improvement might be, it might be incremental, it might be substantial, but is it substantial enough for that decision maker on the other side to maybe put their job on the line or their bonus on the line? Really go back to currently having their hold.
And what's just the closing minutes, and between the folks that are on and they're registered, we have access to the recording. We've got about a 50-50 split of startups and large entrepreneurs listening in. Would love for each of you to think of one piece of advice or thought or consideration that you'd give a large enterprise buying a startup, as well as a founder or member of a startup during acquisition. or we can go to the panel and see the question about the hard shell versus soft shell lobster, which I think has something to do with the aquarium. And
I'm allergic to fish. I can't answer that.
I would say, 2 cents for the acquirer. I think there's a natural tendency, and there's a safe tendency to look at the quote unquote startups that are very established corporations in their own right, and kind of dismiss that next tier down of slightly earlier stage companies. And I think my 2 cents would be not to dismiss that, because there might be that first name that comes to mind might be the best solution, but there's a lot of other companies that might be they're not necessarily super early stage startups that are unproven, but they're proven. They've got good revenue. They've got good customers. They're growing very quickly, but they just haven't been around 10 or 15 years to build up the same brand that some of these larger players have. And so my 2 cents would be to look at some of those for when exploring partnerships or acquisitions, because there's some really great under the radar technology out there.
I would say that for the acquirer, I mentioned it earlier, but really understanding the motive for not only the founder, but the rest of the team for why they do the work they do. And can you provide them the same fulfillment to do that work, especially if acquiring talent and their culture is a key reason why you're making the acquisition. And then from the startup perspective, just to reinforce that the acquisition is a comma in your sentence. It's not the period. Or, Jamie talked about it's the next chapter of the book. We can do lots of literary metaphors here. So, but really understanding that you've got to think about what happens after the deal is done, and how does that look for you, your team, your product, your culture, everything that matters to you in what you've built.
Lakshmi and Taylor have both kind of nailed it, so following that up will be tough. But what I would say is it's about discipline. It's about discipline in the acquirer's mind to make sure that as they go through diligence, like, we're not leaving some of these discussions for later that we should be having now. Right? What's life going to look like afterwards? All that stuff. You're like, oh, don't worry, we'll figure it out. This is going to be great. Arms around each other, Tina clinking glasses. And then the next day you're like, whoa, what do we do now? Spend the time to work on, not just the why, but the how, and then the what following it. Because both parties investing time in that and then being disciplined with their process. Like, I think sometimes we as startups feel intimidated to be like, hey, big company, we need to see your blank schedule. I'd like to see your financials for the last 3 years. I'd like to see where you're spending your money. Like, it's okay to due diligence on the person who's acquiring you and make sure that, post transaction, you're going to be in the situation that you're being told you're going to be in. That's an okay thing from a founder perspective. So discipline, and absolutely double down on culture.
Or building on that, just a pragmatic request of who have you acquired recently? Can we talk to them? And what was
that's a great step. Great step. Yeah.
It's an easy one to do. Well, this has been great for everybody kind of watching in the audience. You know where to find us. We're very searchable on LinkedIn and Twitter and whatnot. And there's lots of content in this space that I think we all push out on a regular basis. So if you enjoyed this conversation, please follow us on those channels. But Jamie, Taylor, Lakshmi, thank you so much. This has been a really great dialogue, and hope to keep it going virtually.
Yeah, I love panels where I learn something from everybody else. This has been that in spades. So Taylor and Lakshmi, thank you. And Paul, thank you to you and Prof for hosting.
Yeah, definitely. This is great. Thanks so much for including me.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.
Yeah. Bye. Thanks.